When Eldon Bowen met Shirley Casera, he was sure he had reeled in the catch of his life.
You couldn't have asked to meet anybody any nicer or any sweeter.
I genuinely think he saw a companion. Eldon is not the type to really like to be alone.
But soon after making her his wife, Eldon came face to face with the real Shirley.
She changed from Dr. Jekyll to Mr. Hyde.
And he quickly realized this woman was after much more than just his heart.
It was very shocking. You just wouldn't expect an older lady doing these kinds of things.
You turned to hide. You blew life to pieces, nothing.
When it comes to love and marriage, things aren't always as they seem. Eldon Bowen's life was never complete without a special lady in it.
Well, I think a woman is the best thing that God has ever created. Every man wants a woman in his life.
Twice widowed by age 55, the Virginia gentleman felt like a fish out of water when it came to dating.
I was very curious about ever getting involved with another woman. And, you know, I stayed single for a long time, but, you know, a man gets lonesome after a while.
By the winter of 2003, Eldon knew he was ready for a special someone, so he decided to ask a friend for some help.
And I said, you know, I got to find me a good woman, you know, somebody to spend my time with. And he said, well, I know a real nice lady. She's a churchgoer. I said, well, you know, how about introduce me?
Her name was Shirley Casera. Eldon wasted no time asking her out for coffee.
Well, when I first saw her, I said, damn, she's a tiny little thing. She was about 8 years older than me, but, you know, she was a very attractive lady.
And she was cute. She was. She was real petite, you know, real small, real soft-spoken.
I said, damn, you know, I said, this might be what I'm looking for.
As Eldon and Shirley got to know each other, they realized they had one thing in common. They had both been unlucky in love.
She told me that she'd been married 3 times. Well, she said her husband before me was a very mean and abusive person. Said he's always picking on her, pushing her, wouldn't let her do this, wouldn't let her do that, was very controlling.
The news threw Eldon for a loop.
I felt sorry for her. You know, I said, how can anybody be abusive to somebody this small and this fragile?
Before he knew it, Eldon was falling in love.
Our relationship was great, you know. I mean, you couldn't ask for anything better.
That Christmas Eve, Eldon and Shirley made it official. They were married in a quaint country chapel.
She was beautiful. She had on a nice suit. She looked fabulous to me. I was real happy that we got married and we went back home and we was teenagers again, you know.
Eldon was on cloud 9, and he was more than happy to give his new wife anything she wanted. So when Shirley asked that he add her name to the deed on his house, Eldon didn't hesitate to say yes, and he didn't stop there.
She had her checking account and I had mine. I said, well, I really don't want to get on your checking account. I said, but I would like to put you on mine, and that way you can pay the bills and stuff when I'm not here.
It seemed like a good idea at the time.
I loved her, and she was my wife. And if you ain't got love and trust in a marriage, then you don't have nothing.
But just 2 months later, Eldon began to see a whole new side of his sweet little wife.
Shirley, she started changing like a different person. And it was just almost like it was overnight.
It just seemed like the real her was coming out.
Shirley suddenly morphed from adorable to angry.
And she was screaming and yelling, cussing me, calling me everything in the world.
I told my dad that something wasn't right.
Who was Shirley Casera, really? It wouldn't be long before everyone would learn the disturbing truth.
I never thought you had to check somebody's record before you marry them.
You just don't think people are going to be like that, especially nice little old ladies.
By early 2005, Eldon Bowen was sure he'd hit the gold mine with his new wife, Shirley.
She was an excellent cook. She kept the house nice, and, you know, I couldn't ask for anything better.
But the honeymoon was short-lived. Just 2 months after saying I do, things quickly went downhill for the newlyweds.
Well, as soon as I put her name on the deed and one of my checking accounts, well, that's when she started changing.
My dad told me that they were arguing a little bit more and things weren't going right, and he told me that it just seemed like she was trying to start an argument, over nothing.
I come home one evening, after having a beer with my friends, and to me it was no big deal being 10, 20 minutes late. Well, she flew off the handle. She had supper on the stove, got mad, dumps everything in the sink. I said, well, maybe she's having a bad day,
But Shirley's bad days quickly began to outnumber her good ones.
She would follow him around, even if he'd go out and get on the lawnmower and cut grass. She'd be walking beside the lawnmower fussing with him.
We're no bigger than what she was. She would get right up in your face. She had a temper. She would cuss when she was mad. But then she'd go to church on Sunday and everything was forgiven.
Eldon didn't know what to make of Shirley's bizarre mood swings. And as the weeks wore on, things just went from bad to worse.
We got in a heated discussion one day. I said, I really don't want to argue about it. So when I got out of the shower, she was gone.
Eldon got dressed and went outside, and that's when he got a nasty surprise. Someone had keyed his truck. Eldon suspected Shirley.
She got back, and I was a little hot about that.
Shirley flatly denied it and blamed the damage on neighborhood kids. But Eldon wasn't buying it.
We lived in a nice neighborhood, and I've never had no kids come in my driveway to do something like that. I said, yeah, some big damn kid with an attitude.
Despite his misgivings, Eldon brushed the incident off. He could never have guessed what would happen just a few weeks later.
I was watching something on TV, and she was getting in front of the TV, wanted to talk. I said, well, we can talk, but I'm not going to argue. Well, you think more about that blank TV than you do me. I said, well, at this point, yes, I do.
Frustrated, Eldon went outside to collect his thoughts. A few minutes later, he was surprised to see a patrol car turn into his driveway.
Cops got out of the car, and I said, no, what's going on? That's all spousal abuse.
Eldon was flabbergasted. Shirley had called the cops and accused him of abusing her.
I said, well, what do you mean? I said, I've never raised a hand to her. Well, what she did, it looked like she took an earring or something like that, and she put a little scratch on her forearm.
Shirley's act was convincing. The officers put Eldon under arrest.
I said, for what? I said, I did nothing. I said, other than we've been arguing.
Police hauled a confused Eldon away to the local jail. Once there, they allowed him one phone call.
About 11 o'clock at night, my dad called me from Gloucester County Jail. Said that Shirley had him arrested. I asked him what for. He said she had him arrested on spousal abuse charges. I just knew he hadn't done anything to her.
Josh immediately posted bail, and the police let Eldon go. But they also slapped him with a restraining order.
They wouldn't let him go back to the house without an escort. So we met a couple of police officers. They followed us to the house. He got 15 minutes to go in, get his stuff, which was as much as he could grab, which at the time wasn't nothing but clothes. After we got all my dad's stuff, we stopped by the bank. So my dad gets some money out of the ATM.
And that's when Eldon's awful evening got even worse. He should have had more than $1,000 in the bank, but the money was gone.
Well, I had 78 cents in the bank, and I didn't know what was going on there. I said, I know there's got to be money there.
Confused and exhausted, Eldon called it a night. With nowhere else to go, he temporarily moved in with his son.
After a couple of days, I went to the credit union to find out why I didn't have no money.
And that's when Eldon found out just how devious Shirley had been.
They pulled up my account, and then they pulled up her account. The day before she arrested me, she went down and withdrew all the money except for 78 cents and transferred it from my account to her account. I said, well, that was pretty slick, you know.
Several days later, Eldon went to court to answer for Shirley's charges of abuse. Despite his claims of innocence, the judge issued a 2-year protective order against him.
He wasn't to be within a certain distance of her or the property, which was his house, which was his property.
I wasn't allowed back in my own house that I purchased before I put her name on anything. I said, well, Your Honor, if you're gonna do that, I said, you might well just go ahead and make it a lifetime because I'll file for divorce as soon as we walk out of here.
But leaving Shirley would not be easy. Eldon would soon realize he had completely underestimated his sweet little wife.
You're trying to hide. You don't have enough manhood in you. You low-lifed piece of nothing.
By late 2005, Eldon Bowen had been through the ringer thanks to his scheming wife, Shirley.
She got control of the house, she got control of the checking account, she got control of the money. I trusted her and I loved her. You know, and that was, I guess, my downfall.
By now, Eldon was living with his son and daughter-in-law after Shirley had kicked him out of his own home.
That really put a load on him. He was constantly telling Josh and I, I'm sorry I have to stay here. I'm sorry I have to depend on you. It was like shell shock for him.
Eldon was more than ready for a divorce, but the state of Virginia required a 12-month separation first. So while Eldon tried to get on with his life, Shirley seemed determined not to let him.
She would ride by the house at all hours of the night. We'd see her riding by.
She started ringing the phone constantly, up to 20 times a day. She would just ring the phone, ring the phone, ring the phone.
She tried to have 20 pizzas delivered to my house.
She was, just all these things to just poke, poke, poke. Yes, I'm here. Yes, I'm here. I'm not leaving you alone.
Saved message.
She would call my dad knowing that she had a protection order against him.
Eldon, I'm trying to find out where you are. I don't know why we can't at least talk.
One time, he answered the phone, talked to her for a couple of minutes. She filed a charge against him for breaking the protection order when she called him.
Received October 18th. You're trying to hide. You're so damn by your family that you're afraid to even let them know that you care for your own wife.
I got stressed out. I think that's what she was trying to do. I think she was trying to really stress me out. I've never been one to worry about small stuff, but it took its toll on me.
You don't have enough manhood in you, you low-lifed piece of nothing.
Eldon did his best to ignore Shirley's bizarre behavior, but Shirley couldn't leave well enough alone. That spring, she made a devastating move.
A friend that introduced Shirley and I called me and told me that Shirley was getting rid of my stuff.
Everything he owned was in the house, and she had the protection order against him to where he couldn't be on that property.
All my possessions that I had, either she sold or she gave away. My boat's gone, my ATV's gone, all my tools. It was the most empty feeling I've ever had in my life because, you got the shirt on your back and that's it. Everything's gone. I didn't even get a spoon.
The stress got the better of Eldon. He suffered a heart attack and lost his job.
That's when I started really getting depressed, and I've never been depressed my whole life. I had no idea Shirley was going to put me through what she did.
Finally, in May of 2006, after a year of separation, Eldon was able to file for divorce. But he never expected Shirley's reaction.
She just wouldn't sign any divorce papers. They had a deputy take them to her. She wouldn't sign them. They had the court subpoena her. She wouldn't sign them.
I said, okay, well, if that's the way it's going to be. We've been separated, going on a year now. Eventually, she might find somebody she wants to get serious with again, and she'll sign my divorce papers.
As difficult as it was, Eldon tried to put the whole miserable experience behind him.
That's when I just let everything go. I was ready to go on about my way and just rebuild my life again.
But a year later, disturbing rumors began swirling around town, and Eldon and his family realized their ordeal was far from over.
We heard that she was out with this other guy dancing, and she was talking about she was going to get married again. So we decided to just kind of start looking at public court records and found out she had gotten married again and was in the process of trying to get a divorce.
Josh was shocked. Shirley had remarried while she was still legally married to Eldon.
I said, what in the world's going on here, you know? I said, I want my divorce first.
At his wit's end, Eldon went to see a detective.
I said, she never signed my divorce papers. I said, now what would that be? I said, wouldn't that be bigamy if she got remarried?
The detective pulled up Shirley's record and quickly realized this was much more than just a simple case of bigamy.
I was wondering how she was keeping it all a secret.
It seemed there was much more to this little old lady than anyone could have imagined.
There was investigations into bigamy, perjury, and financial crimes. Shirley seems to have perfected her scam over the years.
If you have a story of marriage gone wrong and would like to appear on this series, go to investigation.discovery.com. By the winter of 2007, it was becoming clear that Shirley Cassara was not at all who she seemed.
Shirley looked like a very sweet, older lady. She sure did. But her looks were definitely deceiving.
Investigators discovered that Shirley's past was littered with a string of husbands, some of them overlapping.
I found out, you know, that she was still married when we got married. And I found out that she had remarried after me, divorced him, and then got remarried again.
My dad thought she had only been married like 4 times. That's what was on their marriage certificate, but we find out that it's been actually 10 times she was married.
Eldon had been Shirley's 8th husband, not her 4th as she'd claimed.
I felt then that this was a game that she was playing. It made me right disturbed.
But that wasn't all. When investigators interviewed Shirley's 10th husband, his tale sounded eerily familiar.
Prior to this, he'd been married for 32 years. His wife passed away. And he was lonely, and he met Shirley online. Once they were married, within 4 days, she was already calling the sheriff's office here in Gloucester and reporting that he is assaulting her.
While husband number 10 was in jail, Shirley wiped out his bank account. And husband number 7 claims the same thing happened to him, too.
Shirley found gentlemen, started dating them, and eventually marrying them. Once they were married is when her attitude would change, and that's when the allegations of domestic violence would start. The husbands would be arrested. Protective orders would be obtained. She managed to get her name put on properties, onto bank accounts, and she would completely clean them all out.
By 2010, after a 2-year investigation, detectives in 3 different counties had assembled a thick file on Shirley. Her crimes ran the gamut: embezzlement, bigamy, and fraud.
Shirley was somebody you look at and think grandma. It was very shocking.
Shirley was arrested on July 15th, 2010.
Made me feel good. It really made me feel good. What she done, she put me in such a bind. You know, after losing my job, losing my house, getting stressed out, going half crazy. You know, what she did was wrong.
In April 2011, after a trial that was the talk of the town,
That is the meanest little woman that I have ever encountered in my life.
Shirley was sentenced to 1 year in jail for bigamy. In July of that same year, she was sentenced to another year for embezzlement. She became known as the gold-digging grandma in the local community.
I don't think Shirley could love anybody but herself. Her only equal in life was when she looked in the mirror. Everybody else, He was just an object.
Today, Eldon lives in a small apartment close to his son, daughter-in-law, and his beloved grandkids. He has plans to file a civil suit against Shirley in the future and hopes to recoup some of what he lost.
I may never get it all back, but it will be nice to get some, if not most of it back.
He's also taken on another mission to warn unsuspecting men about Shirley's schemes.
As far as Shirley goes, only I can say, guys, watch out, because she hasn't stopped. She's probably already got pen pals in prison.
Eldon readily admits he's not too sure about dating again. But then again, there are plenty of fish in the sea.
But there's a lot of single women in here my age. And I flirt with them and I talk to them, but I don't know if I could ever marry one or not, you know.
Diane Reeve was nobody's fool.
I hold rank in several different styles of martial arts.
I describe Diane as a force of nature.
But when Philippe Padieu swept her off her feet, Diane threw caution to the wind, only to be blindsided by his deadly secret.
The evilness of it terrified me.
A secret just as lethal as a loaded gun.
Predators have a way of attacking their victim, and Diane became a victim.
When it comes to love and marriage, things aren't always as they seem. Dallas native Diane Reeve had always been a fighter.
I believe very strongly in an indomitable spirit, and that means you never quit, you never give up.
But when her 18-year marriage ended in 2000, the 50-year-old martial arts teacher and mother of two was ready to give up on love.
And my friends convinced me that I was too young and too vibrant to do that. And they suggested that I use the internet. I was one of those people that would never have thought that I would have turned to the internet. I'm just the dumb jock that teaches karate.
But in the winter of 2001, Diane agreed to give online dating a whirl. She went on several dates, but screening these men was an awful lot of work.
I kind of call myself the queen of the one-date wonders. I'd go out with them and it'd be like, no.
Frustrated, Diane began to wonder if she should give up. Until one day in January 2002, when she received a message from a French martial arts enthusiast named Philippe Padieu.
He seemed to be a little exotic. He was not your typical cowboy Texas, rootin' tootin' kind of dude.
Philippe was nice looking. He's tall and he's dark and he's handsome. He has the French accent, so that's always kind of intriguing.
Then finally, I agreed to go out with him.
That February, Diane and Philippe had their first date. And it seemed like the stars were aligning.
We had a lot of fun. He entertained me, told me a lot of stories about his life. I did like the fact that he was open with me. He didn't seem to hold anything back. He didn't seem to be hiding anything.
Before long, Diane and Philippe were seeing each other on a regular basis. And after a few months, Diane found herself embroiled in a passionate physical relationship as well.
I told him, I said, look, I'm not seeing anybody else, and if you are, that's okay. I just need to know that, because if you're seeing other people, then we need to be using condoms.
But Philippe assured Diane she was the only woman in his life.
So at that point, the relationship went to the next level.
Diane was ecstatic. Philippe seemed to be everything she wanted.
I felt like we were connecting so well. I thought we started to build a life together.
But just a few years later, everything unraveled, and Diane found herself facing the most terrifying ordeal of her life. By the winter of 2007, Diane and Philippe had weathered their share of ups and downs. But nothing could have prepared Diane for what she discovered that January. It all started with a strange voicemail.
I got a voicemail on Philippe's phone, and I couldn't understand why anybody would have my name for that phone number. I called my best friend and said, I got this weird phone call.
The message didn't seem to make sense, and Diane was certain it was a prank.
And she said, yeah, it's a joke. Somebody's messing with you.
But the joke was devastatingly real, and 2 days later, Diane would find herself facing the toughest fight of her life.
My knees hit the floor. I don't remember anything after that for a couple hours. No recollection.
It seemed Philippe had been deceiving her in the worst possible way.
I think he's a predator in a real screwed up sort of way.
In the winter of 2002, 5 years before the most traumatic phone call of her life, Diane Reeve was glowing. Close friends suspected Philippe Hadieu, a boyfriend of 1 year, had something to do with it.
Bleep was always very attentive to her. He was incredibly good at compliments, and he made her feel on top of the world, and you could tell.
But that Christmas, the happy couple got some bad news. Philippe was being laid off from his job as a network analyst. It was a tough blow, so Diane was determined to do whatever she could to help the man she loved.
I did pay for a cell phone for him. I helped with health insurance and groceries and dinners and going out to eat.
Diane also agreed to let Philippe teach some classes at her school.
I was in love with Philippe. It didn't bother me at all to help him.
So in the fall of 2005, when Philippe began complaining about pain in his back and groin, Diane insisted he go see a doctor, and she even wrote him a check to cover the cost.
He had told me stories before about having had kidney stones.
The doctor didn't find any kidney stones, but he did run a panel of tests for STDs.
So I said, well, what were the results? And he said, well, I won't get the results for about a week.
Philippe claimed the tests were just a precaution. But the following week, the doctor's office called and asked that Philippe come in for his results.
That's when I panicked. I knew that that wasn't a good sign. If test results are negative, they tell you over the phone. And I said, well, I want to go with you. And he said, no, I don't want you to go to the doctor's office with me. I'm a big boy, I can do this.
But Diane was insistent. The day of Philippe's appointment, she drove to the doctor's office and waited in the parking lot.
Finally, after what seemed to be an eternity, he comes out of the building, walks up to the car, and I roll down the window. How are the test results? Everything's fine. I said, all your tests are negative? He said, yep, all my tests are negative. And I'm like, phew. I thought this particular doctor just wants to be extra careful, and they called him in to give him negative test results.
Life for the couple carried on as usual. But for Diane's close friends, there was cause for concern.
I just didn't know that this was good for her. I didn't know if it was a safe relationship. I was concerned that he was busy with the world, maybe other women.
1 month later, those suspicions were confirmed when Diane stopped by the martial arts school on her way home from a night out. Philippe's car was in the parking lot, so Diane went inside to look for him.
And as I made my way around to the private lesson room, I noticed that the door was closed. And I was calling his name. He opened the door and blocked my entrance into the private lesson room.
But Philippe wasn't fast enough. Diane had already spied a woman's purse in the room.
I knew that she was behind the door, and so I slammed that door open as hard as I could. She left really in a hurry. She's lucky she got out of there.
Diane was furious, and Philippe fell apart. He swore nothing had happened, so Diane decided to give him the benefit of the doubt.
I had a lot invested in him. We had a lot of time together, and I wanted it to work.
But just 2 months later, on the day of her daughter's wedding, Diane was betrayed yet again.
He called me and said, "I'm not feeling well. Just go on to the party without me."
Diane went ahead and went to the dinner and then went by his house. And that's when she knew that something was up.
There was nobody at the house. At that point in time, I knew it was over.
Diane couldn't help but wonder, had Philippe been honest about anything?
That's probably one of the things that really broke her heart.
The answer to that question was deadly serious.
This was someone who actually knew that he could be killing these women, and he didn't care.
By June 2006, Diane Reeve was ready to be rid of her philandering boyfriend, Philippe Padieu. The couple had been together 4 years, and now Diane found herself wondering how many lies Philippe had told.
Since I was paying for his cell phone, checked his voicemail messages, not one but 2 women setting up times to be together.
It was a bitter pill to swallow, but things were about to get even worse.
On the Monday after we broke up, I had my annual physical and found I have human papillomavirus. And not only did I have HPV, but I also had some precancerous cells.
HPV is a sexually transmitted disease that can lead to cancer. Diane knew Philippe had given it to her.
I hadn't been with anybody else in 4.5 years. So I thought, well, you know what? If he gave it to me, then he's probably given it to at least 2 other women that I know he's been with.
Knowing she had a duty to warn these women, Diane pulled Philippe's cell phone records and started dialing. She was stunned by what she discovered.
I found 9 other women that he had been seeing, and that was just the ones that I found in the last 2 months. How did you juggle that many women?
The violation of trust was staggering, and 7 months later, Diane found out how dangerous Philippe's indiscretions had really been. By January 2007, Diane was having serious health issues. She had undergone surgery to remove the precancerous cells, but the cells were still growing.
Diane was starting to be very tired, feeling run down, which is very un-Diane-like.
And I couldn't understand why. I'd never been that way before. I always had a lot of energy.
Everyone was concerned, and the explanation would be devastating. The afternoon of January 23rd, Diane noticed there was a voicemail on Philippe's cell phone. The message was for her, and it was from the Dallas County Health Department.
And I couldn't understand why the health department would be calling me on Philippe's phone.
At first, Diane thought it must be a joke.
And I called the number back, and they answered the phone, Dallas County Health Department, and I knew it wasn't a joke.
Terrified, Diane hung up.
I scrolled back through on his phone. The last person that I had talked to was Susan.
Susan was one of the women Diane had called to warn about HPV. Susan had broken up with Philippe in December and had taken a panel of STD tests.
I just called her and I said, I just got a call from the health department. What can you tell me about that? And she said, we need to talk. And somehow I knew. Before she even said the words HIV, everything crashed in on me. And I knew.
3 weeks earlier, Susan had tested positive for HIV.
And the health department contacts the person and asks them to give names of people who might be exposed. She gave the health department Philippe's name, and she gave my name.
Diane immediately went in for a test.
And 2 days later, got a phone call from my OBGYN.
And she said, Diane, I have your test results and you're HIV positive. And my knees hit the floor.
Further testing yielded even more devastating news. Diane's illness had progressed to AIDS.
Her immediate reaction was she had been given a death sentence.
So I started to tell my family, and I called Susan Beth and told her that my results were positive too.
Susan had already given Philippe the bad news and notified him that the health department would be calling. His reaction was unsettling.
And he goes, "What? You gave my name to the health department?" And it wasn't, "Oh my gosh, I'm so sorry you have HIV." It wasn't, "Oh my gosh, I might have been exposed to HIV." It was anger about her giving his name to the health department.
Philippe was strangely cavalier about Susan's diagnosis, as if he had known all along.
And that made her very suspicious.
What did Philippe know? And when did he know it?
We started to get angry pretty early on. We knew something was wrong.
I think he's just disgusting. He's a predator.
We knew we had to stop him.
If you have a story of marriage gone wrong and would like to appear on this series, go to investigation.discovery.com. In February 2007, Diane Reeve was fighting for her life. She had contracted AIDS from her philandering boyfriend, Philippe Padieu.
I knew it was from Philippe. Hadn't been with anybody else.
Even worse, Philippe seemed strangely unsurprised by the news.
We had suspicions that he had known that he was positive for some period of time, that this was no accident.
Determined to fight back, Diane enlisted the help of Susan, one of Philippe's exes who had also been diagnosed with HIV. Together, the two women paid a visit to the local PD.
When we met with the detective, he said, it's going to be a pretty difficult case because it's precedent setting. If we have two people file charges, then that's better. If we have more than two people, then we'll make a case. So we went to work.
Diane and the other women were very instrumental in finding other people who had been exposed to this.
I pulled cell phone records again, and we started calling people to let them know that they needed to get tested for HIV.
The calls resulted in 3 more women finding out that they too had been infected with HIV. For Diane, putting Philippe behind bars became a matter of life and death.
I was very determined to make sure that he didn't hurt anybody else.
Diane and Susan were soon joined by Megan, another HIV-positive victim of Philippe's.
Megan noticed that there were cars in Philippe's driveway every night, so she started writing down the license tag numbers. I had a friend who could run the plates, and we would track down the women and then either call them or pay them a visit.
On February 22nd, the 3 women had Philippe served with a court order from the health department. The mandate was clear: disclose, use protection, or abstain.
And he had to sign that document. There was a car in his driveway that night and the next night after that, and he had not disclosed, used protection, or refrained, because we talked to those women. At that point, I began to see the evil, and it really started to frighten me.
This is someone who actually knew that he could be killing these women. He was, at the minimum, causing serious bodily injury by reckless conduct.
As evidence against Philippe mounted, Diane remembered another key detail that would help seal his fate. That 2005 doctor's visit, ostensibly for kidney stones.
And some light bulb went off in my head, and I thought, could it have been that he really did know that he was HIV positive that day? Could that really be possible?
Diane immediately informed the police, who subpoenaed Philippe's test results.
The medical records indicated that he had been informed that he was HIV positive.
It was the nail in the coffin. In July 2007, Bleep was arrested at a Texas nightclub. He was charged with 6 counts of aggravated assault with a deadly weapon.
The indictment alleged a serious bodily injury by transmitting the HIV virus through bodily fluids, which was alleged as being the deadly weapon.
In May 2009, 6 HIV-positive women testified against Bleep at trial. When the verdict was read, Diane, Susan, and Megan were all present.
We stood and held hands as they read each guilty verdict. 6 guilties.
Bleep was sentenced to 45 years for 5 counts. He received 25 years for 1 count, Diane's.
Bleep never admitted guilt. Bleep tried to blame everybody except for himself. You know, it was anybody's fault but his fault.
It hasn't been an easy road for Diane, who had to overcome a mountain of health issues because of Bleep's betrayals. But ultimately, the fighter in her prevailed.
I'm doing better. Not normal, but better than when I was diagnosed. The medicine is wonderful. It keeps the virus from growing and it keeps you from feeling sick. But there's a lot of pills involved.
Diane has coped through all of this because to do anything less is not how Diane is. Somebody with 4 different black belts, doesn't go down without a fight.
Today, Diane can still be found at her martial arts academy, living and teaching a hard-won message.
No matter whether life knocks you down, you have to get right back up. Fall down 7 times, get up 8.
At 2:17 a.m., the payphone outside a closed diner on the south side rang once, twice, and then went dead, the receiver dangling by its cord, swaying in the winter wind like something that had tried to speak and failed, and by the time police arrived, there was nothing left but the hum of the streetlight, the smell of grease and old snow, and the sense that something irreversible had just slipped through Chicago's fingers, because somewhere between that unanswered call and the silence that followed, a life had already been erased. The alley behind West 63rd Street wasn't meant to be a crime scene, just a narrow service corridor choked with trash bins and graffiti, a place delivery drivers cut through and teenagers loitered, but that night it became something else entirely, a frozen snapshot of violence that no one would fully understand, the body discovered slumped against a brick wall, coat half-buttoned, shoes dusted white with snow, eyes open, staring at nothing, as if the last thing they saw was still burning there. Just beyond reach. Her name was Angela Morales, 26 years old, born and raised 3 blocks from where she died, a barista by day, a night student by stubborn hope, someone who saved ticket stubs and pressed flowers into books, someone whose neighbors described her with the soft certainty reserved for people who didn't cause trouble, didn't make enemies, didn't vanish into alleys in the early hours of a Tuesday morning without reason, and yet there she was, the center of a rapidly expanding circle of flashing lights, uniformed officers, whispered radios, and one question that would never stop echoing: who would want her dead? The first patrol unit logged the call as a possible overdose until they saw the blood, dark and already stiffening against the cold pavement, a single gunshot wound just below the ribcage, clean, deliberate, not the work of panic but of decision, the kind of shot fired by someone who didn't hesitate, didn't miss, didn't stay long enough to be seen, and as the tape went up and the crowd gathered behind it, Chicago did what it always does when violence strikes close to home: it watched, it speculated, it remembered, and it braced itself for answers that might never come. Detectives canvassed the block before dawn, knocking on doors, flipping open notebooks, asking the same questions over and over: had you seen her? Had you heard anything? Did anyone argue? Did anyone run? And the answers blurred together into a fog of shrugs and half-memories: a woman walking her dog who heard a pop she thought was a firecracker, a man on the 3rd floor who swore he saw a dark sedan idling with its lights off, a cook at the diner who said the payphone rang and then stopped, and with each statement, the shape of the night became less clear, not more, as if the truth were actively retreating. By sunrise, the alley was empty again, scrubbed down, reopened to foot traffic, but the stain on the brick remained, faint and stubborn, and in the neighborhood, something shifted, doors locked earlier, conversations dropped when strangers passed, mothers held their children closer, because Angela Morales wasn't supposed to die there, not like that, not without explanation, and the idea that she could be taken so quietly, so efficiently, unsettled people in a way that random violence never quite does. At headquarters, the case file began to grow, photographs clipped, evidence logged, timelines sketched and resketched, Angela's last known movements mapped out like a puzzle missing too many pieces. She left work at 10:43 p.m., clocked out, waved to her coworker, said she was meeting someone, didn't say who, didn't leave a note, didn't call a friend afterward, and that single phrase, meeting someone, became the first hook investigators latched onto, because it suggested intent, arrangement, trust. Her apartment told a similar story, neat but lived in, textbooks stacked by the couch, a half-finished mug of tea on the counter, no signs of struggle, no forced entry, no note of goodbye, just a calendar with a red circle around that date, no explanation written beside it, just the silent emphasis of ink, as if she had marked it as important, as if she had known something was coming without knowing what it would cost. Friends were questioned, then questioned again, coworkers, classmates, former boyfriends, anyone whose name surfaced even briefly, and patterns emerged that raised eyebrows but offered no resolution, a relationship that ended badly months earlier, a supervisor who paid her too much attention, a neighbor who complained about noise that didn't exist, but every lead either collapsed under scrutiny or led to someone else, another door, another dead end, and slowly, imperceptibly, the case began to cool. The media didn't let go so easily, at least not at first. Headlines screamed mysterious killing shocks South Side, cameras crowded the alley, reporters spoke in hushed, urgent tones about a young woman with dreams cut short, about a city once again asking itself how many more names it could carry, and for a few weeks, Angela's face was everywhere, smiling out from grainy photos, a life reduced to pixels and speculation, until the next crime came along, louder, bloodier, harder to ignore. Months passed. Then years. The file was moved from one shelf to another, reassigned, reopened, stalled. The detectives who first worked it transferred or retired, their notes growing harder to interpret, shorthand without context, instincts without explanation, and what had once felt urgent began to feel historical, a cold case in everything but name, surviving mostly in the memories of those who refused to forget. Angela's mother lighting candles every anniversary, her father standing in the alley some nights, just listening. And then, in the winter of 2024, nearly 3 decades later, a man walked into a precinct on the north side, shaking, exhausted, carrying nothing but a folded piece of paper and a confession that would detonate across the city like a delayed blast, a confession that named the alley, the night, the gunshot, the payphone, a confession that claimed to finally explain what happened to Angela Morales, and in doing so, reopened every wound Chicago thought it had learned to live with. Because confessions don't always bring closure. Sometimes, they just bring more questions. The man didn't give his name at first, just stood there under the buzzing fluorescent lights, hands clenched so tightly his knuckles had gone pale, eyes fixed on a spot just above the desk sergeant's head, as if looking directly at another human being might shatter whatever fragile resolve had carried him through the door. And when he finally spoke, his voice came out low and uneven, the words tumbling forward without ceremony or drama. I need to talk about a girl who died in 1994, and in that instant, a case long buried beneath paperwork and dust inhaled again, sharp and cold. Detectives were called, veterans with gray at their temples and younger officers who had been children when Angela Morales was killed, and they watched him carefully as he sat, shoulders hunched, coats still on despite the heat, because this was how it often started, with a story, a conscience, a need to be heard, and they had learned the hard way that not every confession was truth, not every admission was guilt, some were attention, some were illness, some were elaborate attempts to rewrite a life that had gone wrong, but something about the way he spoke, the way he avoided embellishment, the way he corrected himself mid-sentence, suggested memory rather than invention. He said his name was Michael Reyes, 58 years old, a warehouse supervisor, divorced, 2 adult children who hadn't spoken to him in years, a man whose life had narrowed quietly over time until there was very little left but routine and regret, and when he unfolded the paper he'd been carrying, it wasn't a manifesto or a demand, just a list of dates, addresses, fragments of sentences that didn't make sense until he began to explain them, until the fragments aligned with a timeline no one had touched in decades. He knew the alley. He knew the payphone. He knew the diner's back door was always unlocked after midnight. Details, small and precise, the kind that didn't live in newspapers or archived broadcasts, the kind that only someone who had been there could recall, and as he spoke, the room grew quieter, officers exchanging glances they didn't want to admit were hope, because hope was dangerous in cold cases, hope raised expectations, reopened families, demanded answers that might not survive scrutiny. Michael said he met Angela that night because she wanted to talk, not about work, not about money, but about something she'd discovered, something that frightened her enough to circle the date on her calendar, something she didn't trust to put in writing, and he said he agreed because he thought he could calm her down, thought it would be quick, thought it would be nothing, and as he spoke those words, his jaw tightened, because that was where the story always broke, at the point where intention diverged from outcome. According to him, the argument started quietly, voices low, breath visible in the cold air, Angela insisting she couldn't ignore what she knew, Michael insisting she didn't understand the consequences, and somewhere between those two positions, the space between them collapsed, fear curdled into anger, anger into panic, and the gun appeared, not brandished, not waved, just there, heavy and irreversible, and when it went off, it wasn't an accident, not exactly, but it wasn't planned either, it was a decision made in a fraction of a second that would stretch across 30 years. Detectives listened, pens moving steadily, recording every word, every pause, because confessions are fragile things, they fracture under pressure, and already there were questions forming, questions that pressed against the edges of his narrative. Why now? Why here? Why after so long? And Michael answered them before they were asked, said he tried to forget, tried to live around it, tried to convince himself that time itself would bury the night deep enough to survive, but it hadn't worked. Because time doesn't erase, it accumulates, it layers memory until the weight becomes unbearable. They pulled the old file. Photographs yellowed with age were spread across the table, and Michael's breathing changed when he saw them, not dramatically, not theatrically, just a subtle shift that told its own story. His eyes lingered on the alley, on the brick wall, on the angle of the body, and when asked to identify Angela, he did so immediately, quietly, without hesitation, said her name like it still tasted familiar, and for a moment, the room felt suspended between past and present, 1994 bleeding into now. But cold cases don't reopen on emotion alone. They reopen on corroboration. Detectives began the slow, meticulous process of testing Michael's story against reality, against evidence collected before DNA databases, before digital footprints, before surveillance cameras were everywhere, and what they found unsettled them, because some pieces fit too well. His description of the gun matched the caliber recovered, his timeline aligned with witness statements long dismissed as unreliable. Even the dark sedan someone thought they saw idling nearby matched a vehicle registered in his name at the time, a fact that had never surfaced because no one had known to look. And yet, there were gaps. Critical ones. He claimed he threw the weapon into the river, but no record existed of a search, no follow-up, nothing to confirm or deny. He claimed Angela had discovered something that implicated him and others, but wouldn't say what, couldn't say what, as if naming it would unleash consequences he still feared, and when pressed, his answers grew vague, circular, retreating into generalities that made seasoned investigators uneasy. Angela's family was notified cautiously, carefully, because reopening a wound without certainty was a cruelty no one wanted to repeat, and when her mother heard the word confession, she didn't cry, didn't celebrate, didn't ask questions, she simply closed her eyes and said, "I've been waiting for this," a sentence that carried equal parts hope and dread, because after 30 years, truth was no longer simple, it was layered with grief, expectation, and the possibility of disappointment. The media caught wind quickly. Headlines exploded across screens and feeds, Chicago 1994 cold case solved, Man confesses after decades, silence broken at last, and the city leaned forward as one, hungry for resolution, hungry for a story that ended cleanly, with a villain unmasked and a ledger finally balanced. But inside the precinct, no one used the word solved, because they knew better, because they could feel it, the subtle resistance of a case that had waited too long, hardened into something that would not give up its secrets easily. Michael Reyes was charged, booked, photographed, his face suddenly everywhere, a middle-aged man with tired eyes, becoming a symbol for an old crime, and as he sat alone in a holding cell, the noise of the station muffled by concrete and steel, he stared at the floor and whispered words no one recorded, words meant for a woman who had died believing the truth mattered more than fear, words that might never be enough. Outside, in the alley on West 63rd Street, the brick wall still stood, unchanged, absorbing snow and summer heat alike, indifferent to confessions and headlines, because places remember differently than people do, and that place, more than anyone, knew that the story of Angela Morales was far from finished. The charge sheet said first-degree murder, inked in block letters that tried and failed to contain the gravity of what it represented, because charging someone for a death nearly 30 years old wasn't just a legal act, it was a resurrection, dragging the past back into fluorescent-lit rooms and forcing everyone involved to confront the version of themselves they had been when the clock first stopped, and for Michael Reyes, that confrontation began the moment the cell door closed and the noise of the precinct faded into a distant mechanical hum. Detectives didn't slow down after the arrest, they accelerated, because confessions harden quickly if they're true and dissolve just as fast if they're not, and every hour mattered, every delay risked letting doubt creep in. So they went back to the beginning, to the alley, to the diner, to the forgotten corners of a city that had changed its skin but not its bones, retracing steps that had been taken by men who were now retired or dead, trying to see what those men had missed or misunderstood. The payphone was gone, ripped out years earlier when the city decided it no longer needed places for anonymous voices, but its absence spoke volumes. Because in the original file there was a notation, small and easily overlooked, about a partial fingerprint lifted from the receiver, smudged, incomplete, useless at the time, catalogued and forgotten, and now, with databases that span continents and decades, that fragment was pulled back into the light, scanned, enhanced, cross-referenced against millions of records, and for a moment, it seemed as though technology itself might finally finish what patience had started. But fingerprints are stubborn things. The match came back inconclusive. Close enough to tease, far enough to deny certainty. Another almost. Another echo. Investigators turned instead to Angela's life, not the version preserved in family photographs and news clips, but the version she lived quietly, the one that existed in routines and habits, because secrets rarely appear out of nowhere, they announce themselves in subtle deviations. And as they combed through her past, patterns emerged that hadn't seemed significant in 1994, patterns that only became visible when viewed through the lens of a confession. Angela had been asking questions. Not loudly. Not recklessly. Just enough to unsettle the people around her. She'd spoken to a coworker about a customer who paid in cash too often, always nervous, always checking the door. She'd mentioned to a classmate that something at the cafe felt wrong, that deliveries didn't add up, that money moved strangely, and in her phone records, paper printouts, brittle with age, there were repeated calls to a number registered to a storage facility near the river, a place Michael Reyes admitted he'd used frequently in the early 90s. When detectives visited the facility, now renovated and rebranded, they found an old manager who remembered Michael vaguely, remembered him because he'd paid months in advance, because he'd insisted on privacy, because he'd once argued fiercely with a young woman in the parking lot, a memory that had lingered without context until now, a memory that tightened the room when it was finally spoken aloud. Angela had been there. That much was clear. Why she was there was not. Michael's story began to feel less isolated, less like a singular act of panic and more like the violent endpoint of something larger, something Angela had brushed against without realizing how sharp its edges were, and as detectives followed that thread, they found themselves staring into a shadowy ecosystem of small-time operations, cash skimming, stolen goods, favors exchanged quietly, nothing cinematic, nothing that would make headlines on its own, but enough to ruin lives, enough to motivate fear. Still, motive is not proof. And proof, after decades, is a fragile currency. The forensic review was brutal in its limitations: evidence lost, degraded, destroyed under policies that never imagined the future would come asking for it again, the bullet too corroded to yield new information, the clothing long gone, the crime scene photographs grainy and incomplete, and every time an investigator hit a wall, the weight of time pressed harder, reminding them that justice delayed isn't just justice denied, it's justice distorted. Michael was questioned again and again, his demeanor shifting subtly each time, not wildly, not enough to scream deception, but enough to register, his certainty eroding at the edges, his sentences growing longer, explanations more detailed, as if he were patching holes even he could see, and when asked directly why Angela's death involved a single shot instead of the chaos he described, he paused, longer than before, and said, "Because I wanted it to be over," a sentence that landed heavily. Ambiguous enough to satisfy no one. The prosecution began to build a case around what they had rather than what they wished for, emphasizing consistency over completeness, corroboration over clarity, and they knew the defense would do the opposite, would attack the gaps, the maybes, the decades of silence, would ask jurors to believe that a man had lived freely for 30 years and then suddenly decided to ruin himself for no tangible benefit, and that question, why now, hung over everything like a low ceiling. Michael's answer, when asked in court filings, was simple and unsatisfying. "I couldn't carry it anymore." But guilt is subjective. Law is not. Angela's family sat through preliminary hearings with rigid composure, their faces studied by cameras hungry for reaction, for tears, for catharsis, but what they felt was closer to vertigo, the world tilting as long-held grief was suddenly recontextualized, transformed from an open wound into a battleground, because a confession didn't just accuse Michael Reyes, it implicitly asked them to accept a version of events that might never be fully verified, might never explain everything they had lost. In the neighborhood, reactions were split, some relieved that a name had finally been attached to the crime, others suspicious, murmuring about scapegoats and convenient villains, about how easy it was to close a cold case when the city wanted closure badly enough, and those murmurs mattered, because they reflected a truth investigators couldn't ignore: history had not always been kind to confessions, especially old ones. Then came the first major fracture. A witness from 1994, a man who had lived above the diner, came forward after seeing Michael's face on the news, saying he remembered more than he'd said back then, remembered hearing voices, not one argument but two, remembered a second figure lingering at the mouth of the alley, taller, heavier, smoking, watching, a detail that had never appeared in any report, and as detectives pressed him for clarity, his story wavered, sharpened, softened, revealing the unreliability of memory stretched across decades. Was there another person? Or was this the mind filling in gaps with borrowed images, with the debris of other crimes, other nights? Michael denied it outright. Said he was alone. Said no one else knew. But denial, like confession, is easy. Truth is not. The prosecution paused, reassessed, and the word "solved" quietly disappeared from their language, replaced with pending, under review, ongoing, because the case was no longer just about whether Michael Reyes had killed Angela Morales, it was about whether the city could prove it beyond a reasonable doubt, whether it could convince 12 strangers that a story told 30 years later was more reliable than the silence that had preceded it. As winter deepened, snow falling over streets that had seen too much history, the alley on West 63rd Street became a place people visited again, not officially, not with ceremonies, just individuals standing there, staring, trying to feel something definitive, something that would tell them how to think, how to feel, how to move on, but the alley offered no answers, only the quiet persistence of brick and shadow. And somewhere in a county jail, Michael Reyes lay awake at night, replaying a version of events that might never be accepted, might never be believed, haunted not only by what he said he did, but by the growing realization that even after a confession, the truth could still slip through his fingers, leaving behind nothing but doubt. The problem with reopening a cold case isn't that the past resists you, it's that it cooperates just enough to be dangerous, offering fragments that feel solid until you lean on them, and then they shift, because memory decays unevenly, evidence ages without mercy, and every answer arrives carrying new questions in its shadow, and as the Chicago Police Department pressed deeper into Angela Morales' death, that truth revealed itself again and again. They went looking for the second man. Not because they believed the witness outright, but because they couldn't afford to ignore him, not anymore, not after decades of blind spots had already cost too much. So they pulled old reports, scanned margins for names written once and never repeated, revisited traffic stops, loitering complaints, noise calls, anything logged within a 6-block radius that night in 1994, and what emerged wasn't a clear suspect but a constellation of ghosts, men who had passed through the neighborhood and vanished, aliases used once, addresses that no longer existed, people swallowed by time. One name surfaced more often than the others: Daniel "Danny" Holt, a local runner known for hanging around the diner, known for watching rather than talking, known for knowing things without ever admitting how he knew them, a man questioned briefly in 1994 and dismissed just as quickly because there was nothing to hold him, no motive, no evidence, no reason to push harder. And now, 30 years later, the question wasn't why they had let him go, it was whether letting him go had allowed something irreversible to happen. Danny Holt was dead. A heart attack, 2009. Buried in a cemetery on the far south side, his headstone modest, unremarkable, and when detectives stood there in the cold, staring at his name, they felt the familiar frustration of being too late, of arriving at answers after they could no longer speak, because death is the ultimate alibi, it closes doors no warrant can reopen. Michael Reyes was shown a photograph of Holt from the 90s, grainy, faded, but recognizable, and his reaction was immediate: a tightening of the mouth, a slight shake of the head, and the words "I know him," spoken quietly, reluctantly, followed by "he wasn't there," a denial delivered with more force than his previous ones, and that force raised eyebrows, because intensity often betrays significance even when words refuse to. Pressed further, Michael admitted Holt knew about the storage facility, knew about the cash, knew about the side arrangements that Angela might have stumbled upon, but insisted Holt had nothing to do with her death, insisted the confrontation in the alley was private, contained, and as detectives listened, they couldn't ignore the possibility that Michael's confession was incomplete, not necessarily false, but curated, shaped to absorb maximum blame while protecting someone else, someone who could no longer be charged. That possibility complicated everything. Because if Michael was lying to shield a dead man, there would be no incentive for the truth to surface, no leverage left to apply, and if he was telling the truth, the investigation risked chasing shadows while the real case weakened under its own uncertainty. The prosecution debated strategy behind closed doors, voices low, tempers carefully managed, because this wasn't just about winning a case, it was about whether the case was winnable at all, whether a jury could be convinced without forensic certainty, without contemporaneous witnesses, without physical evidence that spoke louder than doubt. And the longer those conversations stretched, the more Angela Morales' name began to feel like a burden everyone carried but no one could fully lift. Angela's journals surfaced next. Found in a box her mother had kept untouched for years, too painful to open, too sacred to disturb, the notebooks were handed over with trembling hands, their pages filled with ordinary concerns, work shifts, exams, money worries, but threaded through them were entries that made investigators sit up straighter, mentions of strange deliveries, numbers that don't match, men who stare too long, and finally, a line written days before her death, underlined twice: "If I'm right, this isn't just wrong. It's dangerous." There were no names. No addresses. No explicit accusations. But there was fear. And fear, documented in ink, carries a weight that testimony sometimes doesn't. The defense dismissed the journals as speculation, anxiety, the imagination of a young woman under stress, and they weren't wrong to try, because ambiguity was their strongest ally, every uncertain word another crack in the prosecution's narrative, and as motions were filed and arguments sharpened, it became clear that the courtroom would not be a place of revelation, but of erosion, each side grinding away at the other's certainty. Michael Reyes's demeanor changed again as trial preparations intensified, his cooperation becoming selective, his willingness to elaborate shrinking, and when asked why he hadn't come forward sooner, why he had waited until nearly 60 to speak, his answers grew more philosophical, more abstract, references to God, to judgment, to debts that had to be paid, language that resonated with remorse but frustrated investigators who needed facts, not absolution. Psychologists were brought in, evaluations conducted, not to excuse him, but to understand him, to determine whether his confession was rooted in memory or construction, and their conclusions were cautious, nuanced, infuriatingly noncommittal. He showed signs of long-term guilt, they said, but guilt could attach itself to many things, real or imagined, and the mind is capable of convincing itself of almost anything given enough time. Meanwhile, the city talked. Barbershops, buses, online forums, everywhere the same arguments replayed. Some convinced Michael was finally doing the right thing, others convinced he was a convenient ending, a way to close a chapter without confronting the messier truths underneath, and that division mattered, because juries don't arrive in courtrooms untouched by public opinion, they carry the city with them, its doubts, its biases, its hunger for resolution. Angela's mother began visiting the alley again, standing where the brick met the pavement, touching the wall lightly, as if expecting to feel something pulse beneath her fingers, and she told a reporter, quietly, that she didn't care who went to prison, she cared about knowing why her daughter had been so afraid, a statement that cut through the noise, because it reframed the case not as a hunt for a killer, but as a search for understanding. As spring approached, the prosecution faced a choice that would define the case's legacy: push forward with a trial that might collapse under scrutiny, or step back, reassess, risk being accused of cowardice, incompetence, or worse, and that choice loomed larger with every new piece of evidence that suggested complexity rather than clarity. Michael Reyes sat in his cell, marking days on the wall, each line a reminder that time, once spent, cannot be reclaimed, and whether he was telling the whole truth or only the part he could bear, one thing was undeniable: his confession had not solved the case, it had transformed it, turning a forgotten murder into a living question once again, one that refused to be answered cleanly. And as the city waited, suspended between accusation and proof, the silence that had once smothered Angela Morales' death returned in a new form, heavier now, charged with expectation, because everyone could feel it, the uneasy sense that whatever came next would not bring peace, only a different kind of reckoning. The decision came quietly, without cameras or statements, made in a conference room where the air smelled faintly of burnt coffee and paper, where prosecutors stared at timelines and probability instead of headlines, and when it was finally reached, it felt less like an action than an admission, an acknowledgement that truth, whatever it was, would not reveal itself under the harsh light of a courtroom, not yet, not like this. The trial was delayed. Not canceled. Not abandoned. Delayed, a word that sounded neutral but carried a sharp edge, because delay in a case this old was both mercy and danger. Mercy because it avoided a collapse that would stain Angela Morales' name with reasonable doubt, danger because time, already the enemy, would continue its quiet work, eroding memories, loosening resolve, dulling outrage, and Michael Reyes understood that better than anyone. From the county jail, he watched the news reports thin out, the breathless urgency of breaking headlines replaced by cautious phrasing, case under review, investigation ongoing, and with each shift in language, his role in the story blurred, no longer the confessed killer, not yet the acquitted man, suspended in a limbo that punished without concluding, and in that space, his mind wandered back to the 90s, to a version of Chicago that felt both distant and immediate. He remembered the city differently than the photographs suggested, less grainy, more intimate, remembered nights when the streets felt alive rather than dangerous, remembered the quiet power of knowing where to go and when, of understanding the unofficial rhythms that moved money and people without leaving receipts, and he remembered Angela, not as a victim, not as a headline, but as a disruption, someone whose questions pierced a system that depended on indifference. Those questions became the focus of the investigation. If Angela had discovered something worth killing for, then understanding what she knew mattered as much as who pulled the trigger, and detectives began to trace the economic veins of the neighborhood in the early 90s, the informal networks that thrived in the gaps left by disinvestment and neglect, small operations that skirted legality, storage units used as intermediaries, cash-heavy businesses that washed money through ordinary transactions, nothing grand enough to attract federal attention, but enough to create incentives for silence. Paper trails were thin, often non-existent, but patterns could still be inferred, deliveries logged and relogged, inventory that didn't match sales, employees paid off the books, and as those patterns emerged, they painted a picture of a low-level ecosystem where information was currency and curiosity was a liability, and in that ecosystem, Angela Morales stood out not because she was reckless, but because she was observant. One former coworker recalled her asking why certain boxes were never open on site, why invoices came pre-stamped, why the same men never ordered coffee but always used the phone, questions that at the time seemed annoying, even naive, but in hindsight felt prophetic, and when detectives asked why no one had taken her concerns seriously, the answer was painfully simple, because nothing bad had happened yet. That assumption, that danger announces itself clearly before it arrives, threaded through every failure in the case. Michael Reyes's connection to these operations became clearer as records were cross-checked, his name appearing not prominently but persistently, a facilitator rather than a leader, someone who knew where things moved but not necessarily why, and that distinction mattered, because it suggested motive without mastery, fear without control, and fear is a powerful accelerant. Psychologists revisited their assessments in light of this context, reframing Michael's confession not as a spontaneous moral awakening, but as a response to pressure that had never fully dissipated, pressure compounded by age, isolation, and the slow realization that the structures that once protected him were gone, leaving him alone with a memory he could no longer externalize. Still, none of this answered the central question. Why the alley? Why that moment? Why a single shot? Those specifics resisted interpretation, stubborn and opaque, and investigators returned to the physical space once more, standing where Angela had stood, mapping sight lines, distances, imagining how voices would carry, how quickly a decision could become fatal, and they noted something overlooked before. The alley's exit toward the street was partially obscured by a delivery truck parked illegally that night, a detail corroborated by a long-forgotten parking citation, suggesting the confrontation may have felt more trapped than previously assumed. Trapped spaces breed panic. Panic breeds irreversible choices. Michael was confronted with this reconstruction during another interview, and for the first time, his composure cracked, not into tears or rage, but into exhaustion, his shoulders sagging, his answers slowing, and when asked whether he had felt cornered, he nodded once, barely perceptible, and said, "She wouldn't stop talking," a sentence that echoed with unintended cruelty, because it framed Angela's insistence on truth as provocation, her courage as escalation. The defense seized on the delays, filing motions that painted the prosecution as uncertain, reactionary, accusing them of building a narrative backward from a confession rather than forward from evidence, and those motions gained traction in a system designed to favor certainty over intuition, because in law, plausibility is not enough, and every unanswered question weakened the foundation beneath the charge. Angela's family endured this phase with quiet resilience, attending hearings that felt increasingly abstract, where their daughter's life was reduced to hypotheticals and procedural arguments, and when asked by reporters whether they feared the case would never go to trial, her father answered simply, "It's been on trial in our house for 30 years, a statement that carried the weight of lived grief rather than legal frustration. Public interest waned, then flared briefly with each new filing, then waned again. The city's attention span stretched thin by fresh tragedies, and in that ebb and flow, the case drifted toward a dangerous threshold, the point where unresolved stories slip back into obscurity, not because they are solved, but because they are too complicated to hold. Detectives felt it too, the creeping sense that momentum was slipping, that every day without decisive action made it harder to justify continued investment, and some began to wonder whether Michael Reyes's confession, however sincere, would ultimately serve only to reopen a wound without closing it, a reminder of injustice rather than its remedy. And yet, there were moments, small and unpublicized, when the case felt alive again, when a new document surfaced, a memory sharpened, a connection solidified, and in those moments, investigators were reminded why they had stayed, why they continued to chase a story that resisted conclusion, because Angela Morales had not died quietly, she had died asking questions, and abandoning those questions now felt like a second betrayal. As summer approached, the prosecution faced mounting pressure to decide, push forward or step back definitively, and that decision would hinge on one final effort, a re-examination of everything Michael Reyes had said, not just for what it included, but for what it conspicuously avoided, because sometimes the truth isn't hidden in lies, it's hidden in omissions. Michael sensed it too, the tightening circle, the unspoken expectation that he would either give more or risk losing what little credibility he had left, and in the long nights of incarceration, he rehearsed versions of the story he had never told, weighing the cost of disclosure against the cost of silence, knowing that either choice would define not only his fate, but the story Chicago would tell itself about what happened in that alley in 1994. The city waited again, suspended in a familiar posture, caught between hope and skepticism, and beneath it all, the same question persisted, unyielding and unresolved, whether truth, delayed long enough, could still carry the power to heal, or whether some wounds, once reopened, only deepen. The breakthrough didn't arrive with a confession or a document stamped classified. It came the way they often do in cases this old, quietly, almost accidentally, buried in a box no one had opened since the Clinton administration, a banker's box mislabeled and shoved behind filing cabinets, filled with odds and ends deemed irrelevant in 1994, and when a junior investigator pulled it out during a routine audit, he didn't know he was holding the closest thing the case had to a turning point. Inside were cassette tapes. Interview recordings. Analog, fragile, their plastic shells cloudy with age, labeled in faded marker with dates and initials, and among them, one tape stood out, not because of its content, no one had listened to it yet, but because of its absence from the official log, an interview conducted but never transcribed, never cited, never followed up on, and when it was finally played, the room went still. The voice belonged to a woman. Not Angela. Older. Calmer. A resident who had lived 2 buildings down from the alley in 1994, someone who had called police the night of the murder but had been written off as confused, unreliable, too shaken to provide usable information, and as her recorded voice crackled through the speakers, it became clear how much had been lost in translation. She described seeing 2 men. Not arguing. Waiting. One pacing near the alley's entrance, the other leaning against the wall where Angela would later be found, and she described Angela arriving separately, walking fast, looking over her shoulder, stopping short when she saw them, and most chillingly, she described the sound, not a shout, not a struggle, but a sharp command, a man saying enough, followed by the gunshot, and then footsteps, more than one set, retreating in different directions. This wasn't memory stretched across decades. This was memory captured in real time. And it didn't fit Michael Reyes's version of events. The implications rippled outward immediately, reshaping the investigative landscape, because if the tape was accurate, Michael hadn't acted alone, and the confrontation wasn't spontaneous, it was staged, controlled, a meeting that had gone exactly where it was meant to go, and that realization reframed every previous assumption, every ambiguous detail, every omission in Michael's confession. Detectives confronted Michael with the tape. He listened without interruption, his face unreadable, jaw clenched, eyes fixed on the table, and when it ended, the silence stretched long enough to feel physical, and when he finally spoke, it wasn't denial that came out, it was resignation, a low exhale followed by the words, "I told you what I could," a sentence that landed like an admission without specifics. Pressed harder now, with leverage he hadn't expected to exist, Michael's story shifted again, not dramatically, but significantly. He acknowledged others had been nearby, acknowledged he hadn't been the one to call Angela there, acknowledged that the gun might not have been his, a cascade of revisions that confirmed investigators' fears, that the confession had been partial by design, a controlled burn meant to protect something larger. But larger didn't mean abstract. Larger meant people. And some of them might still be alive. The investigation expanded outward, no longer confined to Michael Reyes but to a network that had survived by remaining invisible, and that invisibility was now threatened by a tape recorded 30 years earlier by a woman whose name had never appeared in a headline, whose voice had waited patiently on magnetic ribbon for someone to listen closely enough. Records were subpoenaed. Old names resurfaced. Men who had been small-time operators in the 90s now running legitimate businesses, sitting on boards, living quietly in suburbs far from West 63rd Street, and as detectives began knocking on doors, they were met with surprise, then irritation, then carefully managed cooperation, the language of people who believed the past was settled, closed, safely distant. One name triggered an immediate reaction. Luis Calderon. Not a kingpin. not a legend. Just a man known for enforcement, for making problems disappear, for being present when conversations needed punctuation, his name whispered in old reports without context, without evidence strong enough to pursue, and now, 30 years later, he was alive, living under his own name, a grandfather, a respected contractor, and the idea that he might be connected to Angela Morales' death landed with the quiet force of inevitability. Michael Reyes refused to say Calderon's name. Refused even when shown photographs. Refused even when reminded that silence no longer protected anyone, because the structures that once enforced it were gone, and that refusal mattered more than any confession, because it revealed the boundaries of Michael's courage, the line he would not cross even at the cost of his own freedom. The tape's existence changed the prosecution's calculus overnight. What had once been a fragile case against a single defendant became a potential conspiracy, and with that shift came new risks, new legal hurdles, new chances for everything to collapse under its own complexity, because conspiracy requires proof of coordination, intent shared across multiple actors, and proof is hard to find when decades have passed and loyalty has calcified into habit. Angela's journals were reread with fresh eyes. Passages that once seemed vague now felt pointed, references to two men who watch and the one who never speaks leapt off the page, and investigators wondered how close she had come to understanding the danger she was in, whether she had sensed that the meeting wasn't a negotiation, but a verdict already decided. The woman on the tape had died years earlier. There would be no cross-examination. No clarification. No chance to ask the questions that now felt essential. Her voice was all that remained, and that voice, preserved by chance, now carried the weight of the entire case, a reminder that justice sometimes hinges not on grand gestures, but on the survival of small, easily overlooked details. As news of the tape leaked, cautiously, selectively, public reaction shifted again, the narrative splintering into competing theories, lone gunman versus organized silence, confession versus cover-up, and with each version, the case grew heavier, more resistant to closure, because every added layer made it harder to tell a story simple enough for a jury, or satisfying enough for a grieving family. Michael Reyes retreated inward. Interviews ended. Access narrowed. His attorney advised silence, and for the first time since walking into the precinct, Michael complied, sealing himself behind legal strategy and selective memory, and that silence, after so much speaking, felt louder than any confession. The city watched from a distance now, less eager, more wary, sensing that this story would not deliver the clean resolution it had briefly promised, and in that wariness, there was a kind of maturity, an acknowledgement that some truths resist simplification, that some cases, once reopened, reveal not answers, but the depth of what was hidden. And as investigators stood once more in the alley, the brick wall unchanged, the ground worn smooth by decades of footsteps, they understood something that had eluded them in 1994, that Angela Morales hadn't died because she was unlucky, or in the wrong place at the wrong time. She had died because she had seen too clearly, because she had refused to look away, and that clarity, once achieved, could never be undone. The question now wasn't whether the case could be solved. It was whether the truth, finally emerging from the shadows, would be allowed to surface at all. The problem with truth, once it starts to surface, is that it doesn't rise evenly, it comes up jagged, cutting through reputations and assumptions alike, and by the time the existence of the tape could no longer be contained, the case was no longer a matter for a single courtroom, it had become a pressure point for an entire city, forcing institutions to look back at decisions they had quietly buried and never expected to defend. Internal reviews were ordered. Not loudly. Not publicly. But thoroughly enough to make people uneasy. Supervisors combed through old homicide protocols, missing transcriptions, interviews marked unreliable without explanation, and the deeper they went, the clearer it became that Angela Morales' case hadn't just gone cold, it had been allowed to cool, nudged gently toward neglect by a combination of overload, assumptions, and an unspoken belief that nothing larger would come of it. That belief was now untenable. The tape didn't just suggest multiple assailants, it suggested foreknowledge, positioning, intent, and that transformed the narrative from a crime of passion into something closer to an execution, a word no one wanted to use yet, but one that hovered over every conversation, because executions require decisions made in advance, require coordination, require silence afterward, and silence was exactly what had defined the next 3 decades. Investigators began revisiting old informants, names scribbled in margins, people who had traded information for leniency in the 90s and might now be willing to trade again for peace of mind, and those conversations followed a familiar pattern: denial first, irritation second, reluctant acknowledgement third, each step revealing how much people remembered and how carefully they had chosen not to remember it. One man, a former courier, spoke about meetings held in basements and back rooms, about warnings issued quietly, about a woman who asked too many questions and didn't understand that questions could be dangerous, and while he never said Angela's name, he didn't need to, because the timing matched, the fear matched, and his insistence that it wasn't supposed to go that far echoed a sentiment investigators had heard before, a refrain that attempts to soften violence by framing it as escalation rather than intent. Michael Reyes was offered an opportunity. Not a deal. Not immunity. But clarity. An invitation to fill in the gaps his confession had created, to contextualize his role in a larger story rather than shoulder the entire burden alone, and for days, he said nothing, retreating into the safety of legal counsel, weighing the cost of betrayal against the cost of being remembered as the sole villain in a story that had always been more complex. When he finally spoke again, it was with conditions. No cameras. No recordings beyond official transcripts. And no guarantees. He described a meeting arranged by intermediaries, not to negotiate, but to assess, to decide whether Angela could be frightened into silence or needed to be removed entirely, and he described his own role as facilitative, present but not dominant, a man caught between loyalty and fear, and as he spoke, it became clear that the alley wasn't chosen at random, it was chosen because it was controlled, predictable, a place where variables could be minimized. The gun, he said, was never meant to be fired. A threat. A punctuation mark. But threats rely on compliance, and Angela hadn't complied. She had argued. She had insisted. She had refused to retreat into ambiguity. And when the decision was made, it was made quickly, by someone else, someone who had already accepted the consequences as necessary, and that distinction mattered, because it reframed Michael not as the architect of the violence, but as a witness who had failed to intervene, a failure that still carried lethal weight. Names were still avoided. Descriptions took their place. A man who smoked. A man who stood back and watched. A man whose voice carried authority without volume. Investigators matched those descriptions against known associates, against old surveillance stills, against the woman's recorded testimony, and the overlap tightened around a small cluster of individuals, most of whom were now either dead or protected by the erosion of evidence, the slow forgetting that time provides so efficiently. Luis Calderon remained the clearest silhouette. Not confirmed. Not charged. But present in every reconstruction, every timeline, every whispered recollection, and that presence created a problem no one wanted to articulate openly, because prosecuting a dead man offers no justice, only narrative convenience, and prosecuting a living one requires proof strong enough to survive scrutiny, proof that might no longer exist. Angela's family was brought into the conversation again, not with promises, but with honesty, told that the case had grown more complex, not less, that the original confession no longer stood alone, and that pursuing a broader truth might mean sacrificing the possibility of a conviction altogether, and their response was immediate and unanimous. They wanted the truth, even if it came without a verdict, even if it left some names unspoken. That decision shifted the moral center of the case. It stopped being about closure through punishment and became about acknowledgement, about refusing to let Angela Morales be remembered as collateral damage in a story too inconvenient to finish, and that shift gave investigators permission to pursue a different outcome, one that prioritized documentation over conviction, record over resolution. A public report was drafted. Carefully worded. Painstakingly sourced. A document that would lay out what was known, what was believed, and what could never be proven beyond doubt, and the mere existence of that report sent tremors through people who had assumed the past was inert, because official acknowledgement carries a weight that rumors never do. Michael Reyes watched this transformation from a distance, realizing too late that his confession had set in motion forces he could no longer control, forces that would reshape not only his fate, but the city's understanding of itself. And as he sat in his cell, listening to the muffled sounds of life continuing without him, he confronted a reality more unsettling than prison, the possibility that he would be remembered not for what he had done, but for what he had failed to prevent. The media reframed the story once more. No longer case solved. Now case unraveling. Headlines spoke of systemic failure, of silenced witnesses, of a woman whose insistence on accountability had cost her life, and in that reframing, Angela Morales emerged not as a victim defined by her death, but as a presence defined by her refusal to look away, a narrative shift that felt both overdue and insufficient. As summer deepened, heat pressing down on streets that had absorbed too much history, the alley on West 63rd Street became a quiet landmark, unofficial, unmarked, a place where people paused without quite knowing why, and in those pauses, there was an unspoken recognition that some stories don't end when the truth emerges, they begin there. The investigation continued, no longer racing toward a trial date, but towards something more elusive, a coherent account of what happened and why, and as each piece settled into place, the picture that formed was not one of sudden violence, but of accumulated decisions, small acts of avoidance that compounded until the cost became irreversible. Angela Morales had seen that cost approaching. She had tried to name it. And in doing so, she had stepped into a space where silence was enforced not by fear alone, but by convenience, by the collective agreement to look away, and that agreement, once broken, could not be easily restored. The city felt that fracture now, a subtle unease that lingered beneath daily life, because if this could happen here, if this could be forgotten for so long, then certainty itself was suspect, and the comfort of believing that justice always arrives, eventually, began to erode. And as the draft report neared completion, one question loomed larger than all the others, not who pulled the trigger, not who ordered it, but how many people had known enough to stop it and chosen not to, a question that refused to stay confined to 1994, echoing instead into the present, demanding to be answered by anyone willing to listen. The report was released on a gray morning, the kind Chicago produces without effort, clouds pressed low, streets damp with a rain that never quite commits, and there was no press conference, no podium, no dramatic unveiling, just a PDF uploaded quietly to an official website, its existence announced in a single restrained sentence that carried more weight than any headline ever could. Findings related to the 1994 homicide of Angela Morales have been made public. People expected names. They expected a verdict written in bureaucratic language. They expected an ending. What they got instead was an anatomy of failure. Page after page laid out a story that refused to resolve into a single villain, a story of missed signals, of warnings dismissed because they arrived wrapped in uncertainty, of interviews set aside because they complicated a narrative that felt easier without them, and as readers moved through the document, a pattern emerged that was harder to ignore than any accusation. The case had not been lost all at once, it had been lost gradually, through a series of small decisions that each seemed reasonable in isolation. Michael Reyes was described carefully. Not absolved. Not condemned. Identified as present, complicit, fearful, a man who knew enough to understand the stakes and too little courage to change the outcome, and that framing unsettled readers who wanted clarity, because it challenged the instinct to sort people cleanly into perpetrators and innocents, replacing it instead with a spectrum of responsibility that felt uncomfortably familiar. The report confirmed what the tape had suggested. Multiple individuals had been present. The meeting had been arranged. The location chosen deliberately. Angela Morales had not stumbled into danger. She had walked into it, believing, perhaps naively, that reason could prevail where intimidation would not, and that belief, documented in her own handwriting, was now part of the public record. Luis Calderon's name appeared. Not as a defendant. Not as a charge. But as an individual of interest whose involvement could not be conclusively established due to the passage of time and the unavailability of corroborating evidence, a sentence that read like an epitaph for accountability itself, precise, cautious, and devastating in its restraint. There were footnotes. Appendices. transcripts of interviews never followed up. Among them, the woman's recorded statement, transcribed in full for the first time, her words stripped of static and hesitation, now sharp and unmistakable, and readers lingered there, on her description of the men waiting, on the command that preceded the shot, on the footsteps retreating in different directions, because in that moment, the abstraction of systemic failure collapsed into a single, vivid image. Public reaction fractured immediately. Some praised the transparency, the willingness to admit institutional shortcomings. Others saw it as a dodge, an elaborate way of acknowledging injustice without correcting it, and both reactions were valid, because the report offered truth without remedy, explanation without consequence, and that imbalance was hard to sit with. Angela's family read the report together. Not aloud. Not immediately. They took turns, passing pages, pausing when the weight became too much, and when they finished, there was no outburst, no declaration, just a quiet consensus that what they held in their hands was both everything they had waited for and nothing they had hoped it would be, because it told them why Angela had been afraid, but it could not give her back, could not undo the choice that had silenced her. Michael Reyes was transferred. The charge against him reduced. Not dropped. Reframed. Accessory after the fact. Obstruction. Crimes that acknowledged his role without overstating it, and that legal recalibration reflected a deeper truth, that the justice system, like the investigation, had been forced to adapt to what evidence could still support rather than what morality demanded. In court, there were no dramatic speeches. Just procedural language. Just the quiet ticking of a clock that had already measured too much loss. Michael accepted the outcome with visible relief and private devastation, spare a life sentence but condemned to a legacy he could not escape, his name now permanently bound to Angela Morales's, not as her killer, but as a man who stood close enough to stop it and did not. Outside the courthouse, the city struggled to articulate what it felt. There was no catharsis. No sense of triumph. Just a low-grade unease, the kind that settles in when a story ends not with justice served, but with understanding achieved too late, and that unease lingered in conversations, in editorials, in classrooms where Angela's case began to be taught not as a whodunit, but as a case study in ethical collapse. The alley on West 63rd Street changed again. Not physically, but socially. A mural appeared on the brick wall, painted quietly overnight, a woman's face rendered in soft blues and grays, eyes looking outward, not pleading, not accusing, just present, and beneath it, a single line of text. She asked questions, and no one claimed credit, no one needed to. People left flowers there. Notes. Sometimes just silence. And in that silence, there was a recognition that the story had outgrown its crime, that Angela Morales had become a symbol not because she was chosen, but because she had chosen to notice, to insist, to refuse the comfort of ignorance, and that insistence had reverberated across decades, forcing a reckoning no one could fully resolve. The report concluded with a recommendation. Not for prosecution, but for reform. Changes in how cold cases were archived, how witness statements were preserved, how marginalized voices were evaluated, a forward-looking gesture that felt necessary and insufficient at the same time, because reform addresses the future, and Angela Morales lived in the past. As summer gave way to fall, the case slipped out of daily news cycles, replaced by fresher outrages, fresher tragedies, but it did not disappear. It settled into the city's consciousness, a reference point, a shorthand for what happens when accountability is delayed until it loses its teeth. And for those who had worked the case, who had lived inside its contradictions for months, there was a strange aftershock, a sense of having arrived somewhere important only to realize the destination itself was flawed, incomplete, and that realization stayed with them, shaping how they approached every other story that followed. Angela Morales's name was spoken more often now than it had been in decades. In meetings. In classrooms. In quiet conversations between people who had never known her but felt they should have. And in that speaking, there was a form of justice, fragile and imperfect, but real enough to matter, because it refused to let her vanish again into the comfort of forgetting. The cold case had not been solved in the way headlines promise. It had been exposed. laid bare. And in that exposure, Chicago was forced to see not only what happened in an alley in 1994, but what it had allowed to happen afterward, a reflection that lingered long after the report was closed, long after the PDF was downloaded, long after the city returned to its routines. The silence had been broken. But it had not been repaired. After the report faded from headlines, what remained wasn't closure but residue, the kind that settles into the cracks of daily life and resurfaces without warning, because stories like this don't end when the paperwork does, they end when people stop feeling their pull, and in Chicago, that pull lingered, quiet but persistent, a low hum beneath the city's usual noise. For the detectives who had reopened the case, sleep came unevenly. They dreamed in fragments, a voice on a tape cutting out mid-sentence, a brick wall that refused to stay still, a calendar page circled and read with no explanation, and those dreams mattered, because they were reminders that investigation isn't just a process, it's an imprint, something that alters how you see patterns, how you trust silence, how you interpret the absence of answers. Some of them began to notice other cases differently, the ones dismissed too quickly, the ones labeled unfounded or low priority, and Angela Morales became a quiet reference point, invoked not aloud but internally, a mental check against complacency, a question whispered before closing a file, what if we're wrong about this one too? Michael Reyes entered a different kind of quiet. Prison has a way of flattening time, turning years into a series of indistinguishable days, and within that flattening, his confession took on a new shape, no longer a dramatic rupture, but a fixed fact, something other inmates knew him for without knowing why, and he found that being partially honest was its own punishment, because it left him permanently explaining, permanently justifying, permanently haunted by the knowledge that he had chosen the version of truth that cost him the least and demanded the most from everyone else. Letters arrived occasionally. Some hostile. Some curious. A few from people who thanked him for coming forward, and those were the hardest to read, because gratitude implied resolution, and resolution was something he knew he hadn't delivered, and in the long hours when the noise of the facility receded, he replayed the night not as it happened, but as it might have unfolded if he had spoken sooner, louder, if he had walked away, if he had refused to be present at all, an exercise with no end and no mercy. Angela's family experienced a quieter transformation. The sharp edge of not knowing dulled into something more complex, a grief informed by context, by explanation, by the knowledge that their daughter's fear had been rational, not imagined, and that knowledge brought a strange comfort, even as it sharpened their anger, because understanding why someone dies does not lessen the loss, it simply changes its shape. They began speaking publicly, not often, not dramatically, but deliberately, choosing audiences where the story could function as warning rather than spectacle, and in those spaces, Angela Morales was described not as a symbol, but as a person, stubborn, curious, unwilling to let inconsistencies slide, and those descriptions mattered, because they resisted the flattening effect of true crime narratives, the tendency to reduce lives to lessons without texture. In classrooms and community meetings, the case took on a pedagogical life, dissected for what it revealed about power, silence, and the cost of looking away, and students debated not the obvious questions of guilt and innocence, but the subtler ones, responsibility, proximity, the moral weight of knowing enough to intervene but not enough to feel safe doing so. Those debates had no winners. They weren't meant to. They existed because the case demanded them. The mural in the alley became a focal point. At first, people approached it cautiously, as if unsure whether they were allowed to linger, but over time, it normalized, folded into the rhythm of the neighborhood, and that normalization was itself a statement, that remembrance doesn't have to be ceremonial to be sincere, that honoring a life can be as simple as refusing to hurry past the place where it ended. Sometimes, people added to the mural. A phrase. A date. A question mark. And each addition sparked quiet arguments about preservation versus expression, about whether memory should be protected from change or allowed to evolve, arguments that mirrored the larger tension of the case itself, between fixing a narrative in place and letting it breathe. The city's institutions moved on, as institutions always do. New reforms were announced. New task forces formed. Old ones quietly dissolved. And while Angela Morales's name appeared in policy documents and training modules, there was an unspoken understanding that no reform could retroactively save her, that at best, it could prevent someone else from standing where she stood, asking questions alone. Yet even that hope felt fragile. Because the forces that had made her vulnerable hadn't vanished. They had adapted. They always do. And that awareness crept into the collective consciousness, tempering any temptation to declare progress complete, because the case had shown, in painful detail, how easily danger can masquerade as normalcy, how systems learn to tolerate risk until it crystallizes into tragedy. Journalists revisited their own archives, their own coverage from the 90s, and some wrote follow-ups that read like confessions, acknowledgments of how quickly they had moved on, how readily they had accepted official narratives, and those pieces resonated not because they were self-critical, but because they mirrored a broader cultural reckoning, or recognition that attention is a form of power, and its absence can be lethal. In private moments, people who had known Angela replayed small interactions, casual conversations now weighted with significance, wondering if there had been signs they could have recognized, warnings they could have amplified, and that wondering was itself a testament to her impact, because it meant she was no longer remembered only for how she died, but for how she had unsettled others, how she had refused to be invisible. The case entered a strange afterlife. Referenced but rarely summarized. Known but not fully understood. A story people gestured toward when trying to articulate why certainty feels dangerous, why easy answers inspire suspicion, and in that afterlife, Angela Morales became a touchstone not for resolution, but for vigilance, a reminder that truth often arrives fragmented, and that waiting for it to assemble itself neatly is a luxury some people cannot afford. As years continued their quiet work, the city absorbed the case into its layered memory, one more story folded into the geography of streets and buildings, and while the official files were finally closed, there was no sense of finality, only a shared awareness that endings are constructs, not guarantees. The silence that had once surrounded Angela's death had changed. It was no longer empty. It was full of voices, arguments, lessons, regrets. And in that fullness, there was a different kind of unease, the knowledge that remembering is an active process, one that requires effort, intention, and the willingness to sit with discomfort long after the cameras leave. Because the most unsettling truth the case had revealed wasn't about who fired a gun or who ordered it. It was about how many people had lived alongside the danger without naming it, how many systems had functioned smoothly while something lethal moved quietly within them, and how easy it had been, for so long, to mistake that smoothness for safety. Angela Morales had not made that mistake. And the city, forced to reckon with the cost of her clarity, carried that lesson forward unevenly, imperfectly, but undeniably, into every subsequent question it chose to ask, and every silence it chose, or refused, to keep. Time didn't close the case so much as stretch it, pulling its implications outward, thinning them into everyday moments where danger no longer announced itself loudly but existed as a background condition, and in that stretched space, Chicago began to recognize something unsettling, that the cold case hadn't merely exposed a crime, it had revealed a pattern of attention and neglect that could not be confined to one year, one street, one victim. The building where Angela Morales had died changed tenants twice. Walls repainted. Locks replaced. Windows resealed. But the geometry of the space remained the same, angles unchanged, shadows falling where they always had, and those who lived there reported a peculiar discomfort they struggled to articulate, not fear exactly, but awareness, a sense that the room demanded acknowledgement, as if something unfinished lingered just below perception. Maintenance workers spoke quietly about finding marks beneath layers of paint. Journalists requested access, then hesitated. Property managers learned to deflect questions with practiced neutrality. And each small act of deflection echoed the larger theme of the case, that erasure is rarely dramatic, it is procedural, incremental, carried out through routines that prioritize continuity over confrontation. Detectives who had once been consumed by the investigation found themselves consulted on other cold cases, their experience now framed as expertise, and yet they approached these new files with visible restraint, wary of promising resolution, cautious about implying that truth, once buried, can always be unearthed intact. Because Angela's case had taught them otherwise. It had shown them that time doesn't preserve evidence, it distorts it, that memories don't fade uniformly, they fracture along emotional lines, and that confessions, especially late ones, are less like keys and more like prisms, refracting truth into versions that resist easy alignment. Michael Reyes remained an unresolved presence. His name surfaced periodically in opinion pieces, debates about plea agreements, the ethics of partial confession, the value of information weighed against accountability, and each resurfacing reignited the same question, whether knowing more without knowing everything constitutes justice or merely its approximation. Reyes himself refused further interviews. Not out of remorse, according to those who spoke with him, but out of exhaustion. He had reached the limit of what he was willing to expose, and that limit, arbitrary as it was, became a fixed boundary around the case, a reminder that the legal system depends on cooperation it cannot compel fully, and that truth, when controlled by those who fear it, arrives incomplete by design. Angela's colleagues continued their work with a heightened sense of scrutiny. They double-checked sources. They documented interactions more carefully. They trusted their instincts less and their corroboration more. And yet, beneath these procedural changes lay a quieter shift, a shared understanding that courage is often retroactive, that many of the risks Angela had taken only looked obvious after the fact, and that awareness, while valuable, offered no immunity. The phrase Chicago 1994 cold case became shorthand in professional circles. A cautionary tale. A reference point. A reminder that investigative persistence can coexist with catastrophic delay. Students cited it in theses. Advocates invoked it in campaigns. And each invocation carried an implicit warning that the distance between knowledge and action is where harm thrives. Late at night, talk radio hosts still speculated. Callers offered theories. Some credible. Most not. And these broadcasts, drifting through kitchens and parked cars, extended the life of the case in a different register, one where facts blurred into possibility, where Angela Morales became a character shaped by narrative needs rather than historical record, and that transformation unsettled those who had known her, who recognized how easily meaning can be overwritten by repetition. Her family listened occasionally. Rarely called in. They understood the futility of correcting every distortion, the emotional cost of constant engagement, and instead focused on preserving their own version of Angela, anchored in private memories immune to public revision. The city's relationship with the case matured. Initial outrage gave way to a steadier, more complicated vigilance, less performative, more ingrained. People no longer asked why it had taken so long. They asked how many similar delays were unfolding quietly elsewhere. They scrutinized closed cases with new skepticism. They questioned narratives that resolved too neatly. And in doing so, they honored Angela Morales in the only way that felt honest, by refusing comfort. The alley where the mural stood became a site of quiet ritual. Not organized. Not advertised. But persistent. People stopped. Looked. Left something behind. And that accumulation, of flowers, notes, objects with no intrinsic value but heavy intention, transformed the space into a ledger of collective reckoning, each offering a small acknowledgement of failure paired with a fragile hope for awareness. As the decades continued their work, the line between past and present blurred. The case was no longer something that had happened. It was something that was still happening, in how policies were written, in how reporters hesitated before dismissing a lead, in how communities interpreted silence not as absence but as signal. And that ongoing influence complicated any attempt at closure, because closure implies completion, and nothing about Angela Morales' death felt complete. The unanswered questions remained sharp. Who else had known? Who had benefited from silence? What structures had made her expendable? These questions resisted archival storage. They lived in conversations, in discomfort, in the subtle recalibration of trust between institutions and the people they claimed to serve. The cold case, officially solved, remained emotionally open. A paradox that frustrated those who preferred resolution but resonated deeply with those who understood that justice is not a moment but a process, one that extends far beyond verdicts and confessions into the realm of memory and responsibility. And as Chicago carried this paradox forward, it did so with an altered sense of itself, a city newly aware that its greatest vulnerabilities were not hidden in dark alleys or abandoned buildings, but embedded in habits of looking away, habits that only vigilance, sustained and collective, could hope to interrupt. The silence that followed this realization was different from the one that had preceded it. It was not ignorance. It was weight. And it pressed down on every retelling, every analysis, every attempt to move on, reminding anyone who listened closely that the story was not finished speaking, even if it had exhausted its willingness to explain. In the end, what endured was not the confession, not the paperwork stamped and filed, not the press releases that had once declared the Chicago 1994 cold case solved, but a quieter reckoning that settled into the city like a second shadow, following it through seasons, through administrations, through streets renamed and buildings replaced. Because even solved cases leave behind unsolved consequences. Angela Morales' name stopped appearing in headlines. It appeared instead in pauses. In the way conversations stalled when her case was mentioned. In the way people lowered their voices, as if volume itself might invite repetition. The city learned that knowledge does not always arrive as relief. Sometimes it arrives as burden. The burden of realizing how long danger had been visible before it became undeniable. The burden of recognizing how many opportunities for intervention had existed, unnoticed not because they were invisible, but because acknowledging them would have required disruption. The alley stayed quiet. Not abandoned. Not forgotten. Just quiet. A place where footsteps slowed instinctively, where even those unfamiliar with the case felt compelled to look twice, sensing that the space held more than geometry, more than brick and concrete, that it carried a residue of attention, as if memory itself had weight. And memory, unlike evidence, does not degrade predictably. It mutates. It sharpens some edges and softens others. It preserves fear longer than facts. The mural faded. Paint peeled. Colors dulled. But no one removed it. That absence of removal became its own statement, an acknowledgement that some marks are not meant to be erased, that forgetting is an action as deliberate as remembering. Michael Reyes receded from public consciousness. No final interview. No definitive explanation. Just a name anchored to a partial truth, his silence now indistinguishable from the many silences that had preceded him, and that indistinction was the final cruelty of the case, that even after confession, withholding remained powerful. Angela's family marked time differently. Birthdays counted in absence. Holidays redefined. Moments of joy tempered by the knowledge that joy had once been interrupted violently and without warning. They did not seek closure. They understood, perhaps better than anyone, that closure is a narrative device, not a human one. What they sought instead was continuity, the ability to carry Angela forward without freezing her at the moment of her death, and that effort, constant and private, resisted the gravitational pull of the case's public identity. The city carried on. It always does. But not unchanged. Some files were read more carefully. Some calls were returned sooner. Some instincts, once dismissed as paranoia, were given space to breathe. These were not triumphs. They were adjustments. Small, imperfect, necessary. And they mattered precisely because they were uncelebrated. Years later, when the case surfaced in conversation, it was rarely recounted in detail. People spoke in fragments. A year. A name. A sense of unease. That fragmentation mirrored the truth itself, a truth that had never fully assembled, that resisted being packaged into a single, consumable narrative. And perhaps that resistance was the final lesson. That not every story is meant to resolve cleanly. That some exist to alter how we listen, how we wait, how we respond when something feels wrong but remains unnamed. The Chicago 1994 cold case no longer demanded attention. It commanded caution. It lingered as a reminder that the most dangerous silences are not the loud, obvious ones, but the quiet agreements we make to postpone discomfort, to trust systems without scrutiny, to assume that absence of proof is proof of absence. Angela Morales had not made that assumption. She had noticed inconsistencies. She had asked questions. She had refused to look away. And for that refusal, she had paid a price the city spent decades trying to comprehend. Now, long after the microphones were packed away, after the files were sealed, after the last official statement declared the matter closed, her presence remained, not as a victim suspended in time, but as a challenge, persistent and unresolved. A challenge to pay attention sooner. A challenge to interrupt patterns before they harden. A challenge to understand that vigilance is not paranoia, but care sharpened by experience. The case did not end. It thinned. It dispersed. It embedded itself in the spaces between certainty and doubt. And in those spaces, where answers fail and responsibility begins, the true weight of the story settled, not demanding belief, not asking forgiveness, simply insisting, quietly and relentlessly, that silence is never neutral, and that what we choose not to confront will always, eventually, find a voice. And when it does, it will not ask whether we are ready to listen. Long after the city convinced itself the story was over, after the files were archived and the last official quotes stopped circulating, something remained unsettled, not loud enough to call a scandal, not clear enough to demand reopening, but present in the way certain questions resurfaced without warning, in the way some names still triggered a pause before conversation could continue. Because cases like this do not end at the edge of documentation. They end in people. And people are unreliable containers for finality. Years later, a junior clerk in a municipal office stumbled across a box mislabeled, pushed too far back on a shelf to matter, and inside it were copies, not originals, photocopied notes, transcribed interviews that had never made it into the main file, fragments deemed irrelevant at the time, remarks circled in pen and dismissed with a single word, unsubstantiated. None of it constituted evidence. None of it could reopen anything. But taken together, the fragments formed a familiar discomfort, the sense that the case had not been incomplete by accident, but by attrition, that certainty had been achieved not through discovery, but through exhaustion. The clerk said nothing. There was no protocol for unease. Outside, the city moved with the confidence of repetition. New crimes replaced old ones. New faces filled the same roles. And yet, among those who worked close enough to the machinery of record-keeping, there was a quiet recognition that Angela Morales's name still behaved differently on the page, that it resisted being read casually, that it pulled attention even when attention was inconvenient. In certain neighborhoods, parents mentioned her without context. Not as history. As warning. A shorthand for curiosity that goes unprotected, for questions asked in rooms where power prefers silence, and children absorbed the tone more than the details, learning that some stories were not meant to frighten, but to sharpen. Michael Reyes aged. Time changed his posture, his voice, his relevance. What he had withheld hardened into something inert, no longer leverage, no longer confession, just absence, and that absence outlived its usefulness, transforming from threat into legacy, a blank space that others would interpret without him. He became ordinary. And that ordinariness was unsettling, because it underscored the final imbalance of the case, that extraordinary harm had been absorbed into the timeline of an unremarkable life, while Angela's had been permanently suspended at the moment of interruption. Occasionally, someone new would encounter the case for the first time. A student. A reporter. A researcher chasing a footnote. And they would ask the same question, the one everyone asks when they believe time has done its work: so what really happened? Those who knew better rarely answered directly. They spoke instead about context. About systems. About the danger of neat conclusions. Because the truth, such as it existed, did not live in a single event, but in a pattern that repeated quietly until someone refused to ignore it. Angela Morales had refused. That refusal echoed longer than the gunshot. It echoed in the way certain leads were no longer brushed aside. In the way hesitation itself became suspicious. In the way silence was reclassified, not as neutrality, but as data. the cold case, declared solved, continued to operate in the background, influencing decisions without attribution, shaping instincts without acknowledgement, a ghost embedded in process rather than place. And perhaps that was the final transformation. Not resolution. Assimilation. The story did not end. It dissolved. It spread thin across the city's habits, its caution, its mistrust of easy narratives, becoming less a case study and more a pressure, subtle but persistent, applied wherever certainty threatened to arrive too quickly. Angela Morales did not become a myth. She became a metric. A measure of how much discomfort a system could tolerate before acting. A reminder that some truths arrive too late to save the person who uncovered them, but not too late to implicate everyone else. And in the quiet moments, when the city slowed just enough for reflection to intrude, her presence could still be felt, not as a voice demanding answers, but as an absence asking a different question altogether. Not who did this, but how long did we agree not to see it?